Welcome to Scary Stories for Sleep. Sit back, relax, unwind, and let's begin. The man who knew my schedule. This happened 3 years ago when I was 23. At the time, I had just moved into a small apartment on the edge of town. It wasn't a bad place. It was quiet, affordable, and close to my job. The building only had 8 units, and most of the tenants kept to themselves. For the first few months, nothing unusual happened. My life was predictable. I worked Monday through Friday. I left for work at 7:15 every morning. I got home around 5:30. I usually spent my evenings watching YouTube, making dinner, or reading before bed. Looking back, I realized I had become extremely easy to track. Every day looked exactly the same. The first strange thing happened when I found a note on my windshield. It was folded neatly beneath one of the wipers. At first I assumed it was a parking notice or some kind of advertisement. Instead, it simply said, "Running late today?" I stared at it for a moment. That morning, I actually had left about 15 minutes later than usual because I'd overslept. The note unsettled me, but I convinced myself it was probably some weird joke. Maybe one of my neighbors had noticed. Maybe someone was just being strange. I crumpled it up and threw it away. A week later, I found another note. This one was on my apartment door. "You're usually home by now." I immediately looked around the hallway. Nobody was there. The corridor was completely empty. That note bothered me much more than the first one. It wasn't just random. Whoever wrote it clearly knew my routine. I reported it to the apartment manager. She asked if I had any enemies. I laughed and said no. She suggested it was probably a prank and promised she'd keep an eye out. Nothing happened for almost 2 weeks. Then one evening, I got home and found my welcome mat turned upside down. It sounds ridiculous, but I knew I hadn't left it that way. The feeling I got is hard to describe. It wasn't fear exactly. It was more like the realization that someone had been standing outside my front door, close enough to touch things, close enough to watch. I checked my apartment. Everything looked normal. Doors locked, windows locked, nothing missing. Still, I barely slept that night. After that, small things kept happening. A kitchen chair would be slightly moved. A cabinet door would be open. My shower curtain would be half pulled back. Each incident was minor, so minor that I kept questioning myself. Maybe I forgot. Maybe I was imagining it. Maybe I was becoming paranoid. But the feeling never went away. One Friday evening, I stopped at a grocery store after work. As I was loading bags into my car, I noticed a man standing near the entrance. He wasn't doing anything suspicious, just standing there, but he was looking directly at me. When our eyes met, he immediately looked away. I remember thinking he looked familiar. Not familiar enough to recognize, just familiar enough to bother me. I drove home. About 20 minutes later, I happened to glance out my living room window. A dark sedan was parked across the street. The same man was sitting inside, watching the building. I froze. For several seconds, neither of us moved. Then the car slowly pulled away. That night, I called the non-emergency police line. They told me there wasn't much they could do without evidence of a crime, which made sense. At that point, all I had were notes and a bad feeling. The next morning, I bought a cheap security camera. I installed it above my front door. For 3 days, nothing happened. Then, on the 4th night, I got a motion alert. It was 2:14 in the morning. Half asleep, I opened the app. At first, I didn't see anything. Then I noticed someone standing at the end of the hallway. The figure wasn't moving, just standing there, facing my apartment. The video lasted 30 seconds. The person never took a step, never approached the door, never left. They simply stood there, watching. The footage ended before the motion recording cut off. I replayed it several times. Every time I felt worse. The person seemed completely comfortable, like they'd done this before. I saved the video and showed it to the police. Again, there wasn't much they could do. Technically, the person had committed no crime. Still, they advised me to remain cautious. I started checking my locks multiple times every night. I stopped taking evening walks. I kept curtains closed. I changed my routines whenever possible. For a while, things became quiet again. Then came the phone call. I answered expecting it to be a coworker. Instead, there was silence. A few seconds passed. Then a man's voice spoke, softly. "You changed your schedule." I hung up immediately. My stomach dropped. I don't know why that particular moment terrified me so much. Maybe because it confirmed everything. This wasn't random. This wasn't a prank. Someone had been watching me closely enough to notice changes. I changed my number that same week. The following Saturday, I decided to spend the weekend at my sister's house. I needed a break. Before leaving, I packed a bag and drove out of town. I didn't tell anyone except my sister where I was going. Sunday night, around 11, I received a notification from my security camera. Motion detected. I opened the app. A man was standing directly outside my apartment door. He wasn't hiding. He wasn't looking around. He was simply staring at the door. Then he reached into his pocket. My heart started racing. He pulled out a key, and tried to unlock my apartment. The key didn't work. He tried again, and again. Then he stepped back. For nearly a minute, he stood there thinking. Finally, he walked away. I called the police immediately. Officers arrived within minutes. They searched the property but never found him. The footage was clear enough to identify the vehicle. It turned out the man had previously worked maintenance for a property management company. Not my apartment complex, a different one. He had a history of trespassing complaints. Nothing serious enough to put him away, but enough to make people uncomfortable. The police eventually located him. When they searched his vehicle, they found a notebook. Inside were pages of handwritten observations, times, dates, addresses, descriptions of people, including me. One entry listed the exact times I left for work. Another described the clothes I'd worn on specific days. There were notes about my grocery trips, my parking habits, even which lights in my apartment stayed on the latest. The investigators later told me he appeared to choose random people and become obsessed with tracking their routines. Nobody knows exactly what he intended to do. And honestly, I don't want to know. What still bothers me is how long it went on before I noticed. Weeks, maybe months. A complete stranger had been quietly documenting my life while I went about my normal routine, thinking everything was fine. I moved out 2 months later. I live somewhere else now. A different city, a different apartment, a different schedule, and I never follow the same routine for very long anymore. Because the truth is, most people don't notice when they're being watched, until the person watching decides they're done staying hidden. Some encounters happen in person. Others begin with a simple online listing. The next story starts with a Facebook marketplace sale that seemed completely normal. First, a couple of years ago, I decided to sell an old gaming desk. I'd upgraded to a larger setup, and the old one was just taking up space in my garage. It wasn't anything special. A basic black desk with a few scratches. I listed it on Facebook Marketplace for $80 and figured it would probably sit there for a week or two. Instead, I got a message within 20 minutes. The profile belonged to a man named Daniel. His account looked normal enough. Family photos. Profile picture. A few posts. Nothing that stood out. His first message was simple. "Still available?" I replied. He asked a few questions about the dimensions and said he could pick it up that evening. The conversation felt completely normal. By 7 p.m., he was on his way. I lived in a quiet neighborhood at the time. Nothing ever happened there. People left garages open. Kids rode bikes until dark. It was the kind of place where nobody expected trouble. Around 7:30, a white pickup truck pulled into my driveway. A man stepped out, maybe late 30s. Jeans, baseball cap, friendly smile. Exactly the kind of person you'd expect to buy a used desk. He looked it over, handed me the cash, loaded it into the truck, and left. The entire interaction lasted less than 10 minutes. I forgot about it immediately, at least until the next day. Around noon, I got another message. "Desk works great. Thanks." I replied with a thumbs up. A few minutes later, another message appeared. "You have a nice neighborhood." That felt a little strange, but not alarming. I simply didn't respond. Then another message arrived. "How long have you lived there?" I ignored it. A few hours later, another. "Those dogs next door bark a lot." I stared at the screen. That one bothered me. The dogs belonged to my neighbor. You could only hear them from my street. Why was he still there? I checked his profile again. Nothing unusual. Still, I blocked him. Problem solved. Or so I thought. 3 nights later, I woke up around 2 a.m. I wasn't sure why. The house was quiet. Everything seemed normal. Then I heard tires crunching on gravel. I glanced through the blinds. A white pickup truck was parked across the street. The engine was off. No headlights, just sitting there. I couldn't tell if it was the same truck. There were too many shadows. After a few minutes, it drove away. I convinced myself it was nothing. The next morning, I forgot about it. Then, later that week, I came home from work and noticed something odd. My trash cans had been moved, not knocked over. Moved. They were lined up neatly beside the garage. I never put them there. It felt silly to be concerned about something so minor, but it added to the growing feeling that something wasn't right. A few days later, I was mowing the lawn when my neighbor walked over. He asked me a strange question. "Who's the guy in the truck?" I stopped the mower. "What guy?" "The white pickup." My stomach tightened. He pointed down the street. "I've seen him here 3 or 4 times." I didn't answer immediately. My neighbor continued. "He usually just parks and sits there. The same truck." My mind immediately went back to the marketplace buyer. I didn't want to overreact, but I also couldn't think of another explanation. That night, I installed a camera overlooking the driveway. For almost a week, nothing happened. Then one evening, I received a motion alert. A vehicle had stopped in front of my house. The timestamp read 11:47 p.m. The camera wasn't detailed enough to identify the driver, but it clearly showed a white pickup truck. The vehicle remained there for nearly 15 minutes. Then it left. The next night, it happened again. This time, 22 minutes. The truck never approached the house, never got out. It just sat there, watching. At that point, I contacted the police. They told me to call immediately if the vehicle returned. Unfortunately, when someone leaves before officers arrive, there isn't much they can do. The following weekend, I drove to my parents' house for a family gathering. I left around noon, spent the day there, and returned around 10 p.m. As I pulled into my driveway, I noticed something on my front porch. A cardboard box. No shipping label. No address. No markings. Nothing. I carried it inside. The box was surprisingly light. When I opened it, there was only one thing inside. Printed photograph. A photograph of my house. Not from Google Maps. Not from the street. It had been taken from the tree line behind my property. The picture showed my back door, my kitchen window, part of my living room. Whoever took it had been standing on the edge of the woods, watching. I immediately called the police. An officer came out and collected the photograph. He agreed it was disturbing, but without fingerprints, witnesses, or direct evidence, there wasn't much to investigate. For the next several days, I barely slept. Every sound made me look outside. Every vehicle passing the house got my attention. Then things got worse. One evening, my camera detected motion behind the house. I opened the live feed. At first, I couldn't see anything. Then a flashlight beam appeared among the trees. Someone was back there, moving slowly. The light disappeared, then reappeared, then disappeared again. I called 911. Officers arrived quickly and searched the area. Whoever had been there was gone, but they found footprints, fresh ones. leading toward my backyard. The officer asked if I had any idea who might be responsible. I told him about the marketplace buyer. For the first time, someone seemed genuinely concerned. A detective contacted me 2 days later. Apparently, my report wasn't the first. Several people in neighboring towns had filed complaints involving a white pickup truck. The stories were similar: marketplace sales, friendly interactions, then repeated sightings afterward. No crimes, just stalking, watching, following, enough to terrify people. Not enough to easily prosecute. The detective asked if I'd be willing to identify the buyer if they found him. I agreed. A week later, they did. The truck belonged to the same man. When police searched his home, they discovered hundreds of printed photos. Not just of me, of dozens of people. Most appeared to be taken after marketplace transactions. Some showed houses, others showed vehicles. Several were taken through windows. The detective later explained that the man seemed obsessed with observing strangers. He would buy inexpensive items solely to obtain their addresses. Then he'd return repeatedly to watch them. Nobody knows exactly why. There wasn't any evidence he'd entered homes or physically harmed anyone. He just watched, collected photographs, and documented routines. He eventually faced multiple stalking charges. I never attended the hearings. I didn't want to see him again. The whole experience changed the way I use online marketplaces. Now I meet buyers in public places. Police station parking lots. Busy shopping centers. Anywhere but my home. Because most people assume danger comes from obviously suspicious people. The reality is much stranger. Sometimes the person you should worry about is the one who seems completely normal. The one who smiles, pays in cash, loads the item into their truck, and leaves, only to keep coming back when you don't know they're there. Most animals notice things long before people do, and sometimes their behavior becomes impossible to explain. The next story begins with a cat that wouldn't stop staring into an empty hallway. My cat kept watching the hallway. I've had cats my entire life. Most of them were predictable. They slept all day, knocked things off shelves, demanded attention when it was inconvenient. My cat Oliver was no different. He was a gray tabby I'd adopted from a shelter when he was about 2 years old. For nearly 4 years, he behaved exactly like every other cat I'd owned. Nothing unusual, nothing strange. Then I moved into a new apartment. The building itself was old, not creepy, just old. The kind of place with thin walls and creaky floors. The hallway lights flickered occasionally. The elevator groaned every time it moved. But it was affordable and the location was convenient. For the first month, everything was normal. Oliver adjusted quickly. He found his favorite sleeping spots, claimed the couch as his own, and spent most evenings curled up beside me while I watched TV. Then one night, I noticed him staring at the front door. Not unusual by itself. Cats hear things all the time, but this was different. He wasn't sitting casually. His body was completely still, ears forward, eyes fixed on the door, watching. I got up and looked through the peephole. Nobody was there. A few minutes later, Oliver relaxed and walked away. I forgot about it. The next night, it happened again. Same position, same stare, same intense focus. Again, nobody was outside. At least nobody I could see. Soon it became part of my routine. Several nights each week, Oliver would suddenly stop whatever he was doing and stare toward the hallway. Sometimes for 10 minutes, sometimes for nearly an hour. The behavior started getting under my skin. Not because I believed anything supernatural was happening, but because animals usually react to something. A sound, a smell, movement. There had to be a reason. One evening, I decided to pay closer attention. Around midnight, Oliver jumped off the couch and walked to the front door. His posture immediately changed. The stare returned. I muted the television. The apartment became silent. For a while, I heard nothing. Then, a faint sound. A footstep. Outside. Slow. Careful. Almost hesitant. Someone was in the hallway. I looked through the peephole. Nothing. The hallway appeared empty. Still, I knew I'd heard something. A few seconds later, Oliver backed away from the door. The staring ended. Whatever had caught his attention was gone. The following morning, I mentioned it to one of my neighbors. She immediately looked uncomfortable. "Have you seen the guy on the 3rd floor?" I asked what she meant. Apparently, there was a tenant who made people uneasy. Nobody knew much about him. He rarely spoke, rarely left, and had received several complaints for wandering the halls late at night. The description didn't sound particularly alarming. Apartment buildings are full of strange people. I didn't think much of it until a week later. I was taking out the trash around 11 at night. The hallway was empty, or so I thought. As I reached the elevator, I heard a door open behind me. I turned around. A man stood halfway down the corridor, just watching. I assumed he was another resident, so I nodded politely. He didn't nod back, didn't smile, didn't speak. He simply stared. After a few seconds, I stepped into the elevator and left. The interaction should have been forgettable, but something about it bothered me. Maybe because he never looked away. Maybe because he seemed surprised I'd noticed him. When I returned to my apartment, Oliver was sitting by the door, watching again. The following week, things escalated. I came home from work and found Oliver crouched beside the entrance. His fur was puffed up, not playful, not curious, scared. That got my attention immediately. Cats don't usually react like that without a reason. I checked the apartment. Everything looked normal. Then I noticed something through the peephole. A small piece of paper lying on the floor outside. I opened the door. It wasn't addressed to anyone, just a blank sheet of paper folded in half. Inside was a rough sketch, a drawing of the hallway, nothing else. No words, no explanation, just the hallway. I threw it away, but the feeling lingered. A few days later, another appeared. This time, the sketch included my apartment door. The drawings weren't threatening, just strange. I reported them to management. They promised to review camera footage. The next day, they called me back. Whoever left the papers had deliberately avoided the cameras. They appeared from a blind spot in the hallway, dropped the paper, then disappeared. No useful footage, no identification, nothing. By then, Oliver's behavior had become constant. Every evening, he'd sit by the door, watching, listening, waiting. One night, around 1 a.m., I woke up to a noise, a soft scratching sound. At first, I thought it was Oliver. Then I realized he was asleep on the bed. The scratching continued, slow, deliberate, coming from the front door. I froze. The sound lasted several seconds, then stopped. I grabbed my phone and quietly approached the entrance. The hallway beyond the peephole looked empty, but something felt wrong, very wrong. I waited. Nothing happened. Eventually, I returned to bed. The next morning, I opened the door. For shallow scratch marks ran across the lower portion of the wood. Fresh. They hadn't been there before. I immediately contacted apartment management again. This time, they took things more seriously. Additional cameras were installed. Security patrols increased. For nearly 2 weeks, nothing happened. Then the cameras finally captured something. At 12:38 a.m., a man appeared in the hallway, the same man I'd seen near the elevator. He slowly walked toward my apartment, stopped outside my door, and stood there for almost 12 minutes, not knocking, not speaking, just standing, watching the door. Eventually, he left. Management forwarded the footage to police. Investigators learned he had been the subject of multiple complaints from other tenants over the years. Nothing violent, nothing criminal enough for major charges, but enough reports to establish a pattern. The police interviewed him, and that's when things became truly unsettling. According to the officer I spoke with, the man claimed he liked listening to people inside their apartments. That was it. He'd wander the hallways late at night and stand outside random doors. listening, sometimes for minutes, sometimes for hours. He said he enjoyed learning people's routines, learning when they slept, when they left, when they came home. The explanation somehow made everything worse, because it was real. No ghost, no monster, just a person, a very disturbed person. Management terminated his lease shortly afterward. Police kept an eye on him until he moved away, and after he left, Oliver stopped staring at the hallway. Completely, the behavior disappeared almost overnight. No more waiting by the door, no more tense staring, no more strange reactions. It was as if whatever had captured his attention for months was finally gone. Even now, years later, I think about that. Not because of the man, but because of how early Oliver noticed him. Long before I did. Long before the cameras. Long before the complaints. My cat knew something was wrong, and every night he sat by that door trying to tell me. I just didn't understand what he was saying. Cats tend to react by watching. Now let's move on to the 911 call that did not make any sense. Back when I was 19, I worked the closing shift at a small grocery store. It wasn't a bad job. Most nights were predictable. Stock shelves, sweep the floors, lock the doors, go home. The store sat on the edge of town, surrounded by empty lots and a few warehouses. After midnight, the area became almost completely deserted. The only people around were truck drivers and the occasional late-night customer. One Thursday night, I was working with only one other employee, my manager, Chris. Around 12:40 a.m., the store was empty. Chris was in the back office doing paperwork. I was straightening shelves near the registers. That's when the store phone rang. I answered it without thinking. "Thank you for calling Market Fresh. How can I help you?" For a few seconds, nobody spoke. Then I heard breathing. Slow, steady. I figured it was a prank call. "Hello." More silence. Then a woman whispered something. I couldn't understand it. What was that? Another whisper. Still impossible to make out. The connection sounded terrible, like she was speaking from very far away. Then the line went dead. I shrugged it off. Weird calls happen. I went back to work. About 10 minutes later, the phone rang again. Same number, at least according to the caller ID. I answered. Immediately, I heard the same breathing. The same woman. This time she sounded terrified. "Please." The word was barely audible. Then she stopped speaking. I straightened up. Something about her voice felt genuine, not like a prank. "Ma'am, are you okay?" Silence. Then I heard another voice. A man, far away. I couldn't make out what he said. The woman suddenly gasped. The line disconnected. I stared at the receiver. My stomach felt strange. I walked into the office and told Chris about the calls. He listened, then laughed. Probably kids. Maybe he was right, but I wasn't convinced. A few minutes later, the phone rang again. This time Chris answered. I watched his expression change almost immediately. The smile disappeared. "Hello." Silence. A pause. Then, "Who is this?" Another pause. Chris slowly looked toward me. I could tell he was hearing something different than before. Finally, he hung up. "What happened?" I asked. Chris frowned. There was a woman crying. Neither of us spoke for a moment. The store suddenly felt much quieter. Then the phone rang again. For the fourth time. Chris answered immediately. "Listen, if you need help, tell us where you are." Nothing. Then his face changed. He pressed the speaker button. A woman was whispering. The sound was faint, broken, difficult to understand. We leaned closer. Then we heard it clearly. "Please don't let him see me." Every hair on my arms stood up. The line went dead. Neither of us laughed after that. Chris called 911 and explained everything. The dispatcher asked for the number. Then she told us something odd. The calls weren't coming from a cell phone. They were coming from a landline. A landline located less than 2 miles away. Police were dispatched immediately. For the next 20 minutes, nothing happened. No calls, no updates, Just silence. Then the phone rang again. The same number. Chris answered. This time the woman sounded panicked, like she was trying not to cry. He knows. Those were the only words she said. Then a loud crashing noise echoed through the receiver. The line disconnected. At that exact moment, police radio traffic began flooding through the scanner app Chris kept on his phone. Units were arriving at the address. Something was happening. We listened while continuing to work. The updates were confusing. Officers had reached the property. Nobody answered the door. Lights were on inside. Vehicles were present, but there was no response. A few minutes later, dispatch instructed officers to enter the residence. That got our attention. Something was definitely wrong. Then the radio went quiet. For nearly 10 minutes. No updates. Nothing. Finally, an officer reported finding a woman inside, alive, hiding in a locked crawl space beneath the house. I remember looking at Chris. Neither of us said a word. The officer continued speaking. The woman was injured but conscious. She kept insisting someone else had been in the house, someone who had been searching for her. Additional units began searching the property, including the surrounding woods. Then another update came through. They found him, a man approximately half a mile away, running through a field. The suspect was arrested shortly afterward. The details eventually appeared in local news reports. The woman had been hiding for nearly 6 hours. According to investigators, she managed to lock herself inside a small crawl space after an argument with her ex-boyfriend turned violent. The man spent hours searching the house, unable to find her. At some point, she discovered an old telephone line inside the crawl space. One that was still connected. She couldn't call 911 directly because the line was damaged and only connected intermittently. For reasons nobody could fully explain, every successful connection routed to our grocery store. Not emergency services. Not another residence. Our store. Each time she managed to get a connection, she tried to ask for help. But she had to whisper, because she believed the man was still inside the house. Listening. Waiting. Searching. The reason the calls kept disconnecting was simple. The damaged line kept failing. Sometimes after a few seconds. Sometimes after a minute. The police later said that if we had ignored the calls, they might never have found her in time. That realization stayed with me for years, because when the first call came in, I almost hung up. When the second call came in, I nearly ignored it. And when the third call came in, I almost convinced myself it was a prank. Most people think emergencies are obvious. They imagine screaming, panic, chaos, but sometimes a person's life depends on a whisper. A few words barely loud enough to hear. I've worked a lot of jobs since then, but I've never forgotten that night. And every time I hear a phone ring unexpectedly, part of me remembers that terrified voice, quietly saying, "Please don't let him see me." A sentence spoken so softly that it almost wasn't heard at all. And that concludes tonight's stories. Thank you for spending part of your evening with Scary Stories for Sleep. If you enjoyed these stories, consider subscribing for more unsettling tales, strange encounters, and realistic horror. Now, as the campfire crackles and the crickets continue their song, it's time to relax, unwind, and get some rest. Sleep well, and remember, the scariest stories are often the ones that could really happen. Good night.